All right, let's dive into something that's, well, a bit of a head scratcher. We're talking about the solar industry, where panels have never been cheaper and they're popping up on roofs everywhere. But behind the scenes, the companies actually making those panels are in deep, deep trouble. So, what is going on? This is the big puzzle we're going to unpack. I mean, solar installations are going through the roof globally. You'd think the manufacturers would be rolling in cash, right? But nope. The reality is the complete opposite. It's a weird situation, and it gets to the very heart of our clean energy future.
And wow, this chart really tells the story. On one side, you see installations soaring. That's the demand. But on the other, look at the profits for the big manufacturers. They've just cratered. For the major Chinese companies, their profit margin dropped from over 12% to under 5% in just 1 year. Think about that. They're selling more stuff than ever, but making way, way less money.
Okay, so to figure this out, we've got to go back a bit. We need to understand how one country, China, basically came to run the entire solar game. I mean, just let that number sink in for a moment. Over 80%. And we're not just talking about the final assembly, we're talking about everything. Every single critical step, from digging the raw materials out of the ground to that finished panel. That is an unbelievable level of control concentrated in one place. So how on earth did they pull this off? Well, it wasn't magic. It was a really smart four-part playbook. First, economies of scale, just building bigger factories than anyone else to make things cheaper. Second, vertical integration, which means controlling the whole process from start to finish. Third, a huge amount of government support with things like subsidies. And finally, they just kept innovating to make better, more efficient panels.
And that whole vertical integration thing, this is what it actually looks like. You start with a raw mineral, quartzite, and you control every single step until it becomes a finished solar panel. By owning that entire journey, companies could find savings at every turn, building a cost advantage that became almost impossible for anyone else in the world to compete with. But here's the thing, when one player has that much control over something so important, it comes with a price. And it's a price that involves some pretty significant risks, not just for the industry, but honestly for all of us. This brings us to what you might call the industry's Achilles heel, a material called polysilicon. It's the key ingredient for most solar panels. And by next year, it's expected that China will be making nearly 95% of the entire world's supply. That creates a massive, massive vulnerability for every other country on. And if you think that's concentrated, get this, it gets even more extreme. A whopping 40% of the entire world's polysilicon comes from just one single province, Xinjiang. When so much of a critical global resource comes from one specific area, the whole supply chain becomes incredibly fragile. And this is where some very serious ethical questions come into play. Back in 2021, a report from Sheffield Hallam University in the UK sparked global outrage when it concluded, and I'm quoting here, that forced labor was used in polysilicon manufacturing in the region. So you can really boil down the main criticisms into three big buckets. You've got the human rights allegations we just touched on. Then there are the accusations of unfair trade practices, which have led to things like sanctions and tariffs. And finally, there's the environmental irony of it all. A lot of this green technology is actually being built using a power grid that relies heavily on coal. So, as you can imagine, the rest of the world isn't just sitting still. We're now seeing a global scramble as other major economies try to build up their own solar industries. And you've got to understand, this isn't just about business anymore. It's become a huge national security issue. And everyone seems to have a different game plan. The US is going with a carrot and stick approach. Huge subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act to encourage domestic production, plus tariffs to discourage imports. The EU, on the other hand, is mostly focused on getting as many panels installed as possible to meet climate goals, even if that means relying on China. And then you've got India, which is trying to build its industry from the ground up with tariffs and rules that basically say you have to build it here. But they all face this massive uphill battle. Because after years of investment in building at a huge scale, it's just plain cheaper to make a solar panel in China. We're talking about 20% cheaper than in the United States. Even with all the new subsidies, closing a cost gap that big is incredibly difficult. Now, here's a surprising twist that kind of flips a common assumption on its head. You'd think that panels made with a cleaner energy grid would have a way smaller carbon footprint, right? But a Duke University study found something different. While the US does have a slight edge, the massive industrial efficiency in China means the total carbon footprint per panel is remarkably similar. Kind of makes you rethink things. And all of these different threads,
the dominance, the low costs, the global reaction, they all lead us right here, to this moment, to a crisis of oversupply that is flooding the market and shaking the entire industry to its core.
This number says it all, really. In 2023, the world's factories could make between 2 and 4 times the number of solar panels that the world actually needed. That's a mind-boggling glut of product, a flood of panels with nowhere to go. So where did this flood come from? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle was China's own explosive growth. Between just 2022 and 2023, their new solar capacity grew by an incredible 163%. That just poured fuel on the fire, adding a ton of manufacturing capacity to a market that was already saturated.
And don't make the mistake of thinking this is just a temporary dip. Most analysts believe this new normal, rock-bottom prices, razor-thin profit margins, and massive overcapacity is here to stay for a while, probably until at least 2027. So we end right back where we started with this paradox. On one hand, we all get access to the cheapest clean energy in history, which is fantastic for fighting climate change. But on the other hand, the system delivering it is financially broken. For the producers, it's ethically complicated, and it's built on a geopolitically fragile foundation. And that leaves us with one final crucial question. How long can the solar paradox possibly last?